Good afternoon.
Good evening.
Welcome back to Tipsy Casting. I'm Jen, and this is my co-host, Jess. Thank you all so much for tuning in for what's going to be a very insightful episode. We're so excited to welcome the wonderful Towne to Tipsy Casting.
Towne is a Los Angeles-based performer, award-winning writer, director, and teacher. For 20 years, he's coached business professionals, athletes, and actors. Joe has worked with actors like Jennifer Love Hewitt, Hilary Swank, Rebel Wilson, and most recently starred as the lead of The Art of Christmas. He's worked as an audition and acting coach and teacher at one of the top private acting studios in Hollywood, where he co-created their audition technique program.
As the CEO and co-founder of the Performer's Mindset, Joe works with performers to elevate their craft, with corporate professionals to bring the mindset practices into the workplace, and with creatives of all types, preparing them to show up at their best in life's biggest moments. As a creator and host of the Better podcast, Joe explores the nuances of creative practices and leads conversations that help us individually and collectively develop healthier relationships with our mind, our craft, and the world.
Now grab a cocktail
Or a mocktail.
and enjoy. Hey, Joe, how are you?
So good. So good today. Yeah,
Good.
thank you for asking. How are you both?
We're good. You know, chugging
Doing
along.
well for a Tuesday. It's a Tuesday, so
Right.
only as good as it can be.
Do they do Taco Tuesday in London? That's my question.
No, you want to know? I'm going to steal a little bit of your wine of the week thunder and tell you that there is no good Mexican in London.
What?
It's not accessible here. I hate it. I've had this conversation with 3 people now in the last 2 days, 3 Americans, who we are all pissed off that there's not good Mexican here. I've looked, I've spent so much money trying to find it, and it is not accessible. So no Taco Tuesday here.
This
Oh,
sounds like
no.
a franchise opportunity for those listeners who want to channel their current energy towards something creative.
Amazing.
I actually said, I was telling somebody, I was like, if somebody wanted to open a Chick-fil-A, a Trader Joe's, and a solid Mexican restaurant, you would be a billionaire here. Just saying.
Okay.
Get the show rolling over there.
Yeah, we're going to put this on TikTok, this clip, and it's going to go viral.
I love it. Well,
Financial
first
advice.
of all, what are we all drinking? Joe, what are you drinking this today?
Well, today I am traveling to you from Italy.
Oh,
So I'm having a crodino, which is basically an aperitif that you might find before dinner.
oh.
So are we
Oh.
cheersing? Are we doing that later?
No.
Are we
Okay,
just
we're gonna-
drinking and
We
talking?
gotta,
What are we
we
doing?
gotta go through. I have a rosé today, an Italian rosé, so I'm in Italy as well, which is
Ciao.
nice. Ciao.
I stole Jen's idea and I got a Bev Rosé, California rosé wine in a can. And, teach their own. But
Yeah.
yes, cheers,
Rosé all
cheers
day.
to a
Cheers.
lovely
Cheers.
day. So to start our chat, what is your wine of the week, Joe?
My wine of the week, just one.
Just the one.
I'm going to call this one "Get Off My Lawn." I feel like people call you on the phone, and they don't leave a voicemail message. They just let it ring. And if you have Do Not Disturb on, if you're in the movies, if you are in the middle of a meeting or say recording a podcast, you don't know if there's an emergency. You just assume they could be trapped under something heavy, and they don't let you know what the reason was for their call, even after the fact. So you sit there and you wonder, or you miss it altogether, and you're like, you wonder why you haven't heard from somebody for long periods of time. I don't understand why we ghost. I don't understand why we don't follow through with communication. I don't understand why we don't have uncomfortable conversations. I don't understand why we don't see things through, and then we just sort of let ourselves float down the river of communication in life. It's so simple. It's so simple. And I don't know, I'm definitely a Gen Xer when it comes to this kind of communication. I'm the guy who will call you, and as you can tell, because I'm still talking, leave you a very long voicemail message with all of the pertinent information. Some people don't even listen to the whole thing. They just say, I just called back. I checked out after minute 4 of your voicemail message. It's not that long. Let's not get crazy. But I do think communication is probably the umbrella. And for me, it's the ring, no message.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like this assumption that we don't need to know why. Like I think I'm guilty of avoiding conversation of like if a number comes up that I don't recognize, I don't answer it and I let it go to voicemail so I can
That's fair
hear what
game.
they want. But if they leave no message, I have no reason to call you back. So I get it.
Thank you. Thanks for having
You
my
guys
back.
would hate me because I am that person who does that.
Oh, Jen.
I don't leave messages, and even people who leave me messages, I never listen to the message. I just call them back, and I'm like, "What did you want?"
All right. So, Jen, this is our opportunity
sorry.
to have compassion for a different mindset. Why on earth do you do this? Tell us the ways of the Force.
So partially, most of the time I do it is because there's a certain, like, I feel like it's only people who are like maybe a bit older that leave voicemails. And so like Joe, you look young. No.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.
It's like, so it's like my mom, or like I have this one producer who calls me all the time and literally will leave me exactly, you're like talking, I'm like, oh my God, this is me. But he'll leave me like 3-minute long messages, and it's like, and then I'll call him back and he'll then tell me exactly it all over again. I'm like, no, I listened to your message. So I quit listening to them because I was like, well, you're just going to tell me what you were going to say anyway. So just go ahead. Like, why did you call me? So
it's a time
I
saving.
get it. I
Time
get
saving.
your frustration.
I don't want to listen too long because you're going to tell me again, or it's going to take all this time. I might as well just put the blinking light on and you'll know. You'll know.
Jen, question for you. Do you text after you've called and not left a message, or that's it?
Like is it a cell phone or a landline?
I mean,
Cell
I think
phone.
97% of the time now it'll be a cell phone.
Yeah. Or just see, so like if it's a cell phone and I call, yeah. Because what I will do is like if I call like CAA and they don't answer, I will then follow up with an email and be like, "Hello, I just left word for you."
Oh, I see how
they
it
don't
is.
listen. Yes,
that's fair.
Yeah, but I don't really. Yeah, no, because I don't know. I don't think I actually like leave a message or followed up with a text. I'm usually like, oh, I'll just call them back, and I usually just remember because I'm just not. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't feel like I leave voicemails.
To mull over.
What I'm hearing though is you actually will, in certain circumstances, do a follow-up. You'll text, you'll email, you'll do something to let people know the reason for your call.
Yeah. Or I've noticed like a lot of times a big thing nowadays is if somebody's on the other line or something and you call, they'll text you and say, hey, I'm on the other line, I'll call you back. And they're like, great. Okay. So no need to leave a voicemail. So that I find, I'd say that would be my most common situation, is where somebody's not, except for my mother, who like will answer my call no matter what. She'll be in the middle of like a teacher's meeting. She'll be like in with parents and she's like, what, are you dying? And I'm like, no. She's like, well, I have like 5 people staring at me right now. I was like, well, you don't have to answer. I didn't know you were in a meeting. But other than her, I think everybody will just like do the text back.
Yeah, my mom sends this, can I call you later, or whatever the auto dial is of like, can I call you back later? And I always respond, no, just to mess with her. It's always a good time with us, though. I love it. Well, thank you for your wine, Joe. It's all very relatable. But let's dive into you, because you have had sort of a pretty incredible journey of like your evolution into all the different layers of you. So tell us about how you got into the industry as an actor, and how that has evolved for you.
Yeah. Well, I think I was really fortunate. I mean, I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island in New York at a time when public school had arts funding. And so coming through junior high school into high school, my mom was really encouraging me to try out for a play. And I was absolutely interested, but totally petrified. And so I opted to not do that for 2 years. And when I got into freshman year of high school, the drama teacher also was my English teacher. And so I think after one class where he had us read a Shakespearean sonnet aloud, he asked me to chat after class and invited me down to see what they were doing. They were doing The Miracle Worker. And so he invited me to be part of the production. I worked backstage, and I ended up with my first role being the offstage voice of Annie Sullivan's dead brother. So my first job was technically a voiceover role. And I think it got me comfortable around it. And they did 7 shows a year, and they did summer shows, and I was able to assistant direct in the middle school, and I did community theater. And my dad was in commercial real estate in New York, and he had spoken to a manager and said, what would you recommend for my son if he was interested in pursuing a career in the arts? And she said, I think he should go to Stage Door Manor. So I went to a theater camp for my summer between sophomore and junior year. And when I was there, I was around a bunch of people who obviously were really committed to theater, and it was really a very profound experience, so many different great classes. And one of the things that happened is they did a talent search for a new Broadway show, a new Neil Simon show. And so Jay Binder came up, and he was auditioning all the kids. And because we were auditioning in a way that was really familiar, everyone's in the hallway. Sometimes you're in the room for a few of them. That was how I'd always auditioned before. It didn't seem like extra pressure of any kind. It seemed like a lot of fun. And so they had a series of callbacks. I think I was called back 4 times. And the next one, I would have gone to New York to read for the producing team. And after my 4th audition, he called me over, and he politely let me know that physically I would not be right for this role. But he was really encouraging, and he said, you should keep doing this. And I think it changed the trajectory of how I saw myself. I think the encouragement, one sentence, really solidified my desire to go to theater school after that. And so my journey was going to be either NYU or USC, and I wanted to get an experience far away from my life in New York. So I came out to USC and pursued, I was going to do double major, film and theater. And the film minor is like a major minus 2 classes. It's way too many. So instead, I just minored in psychology, interned at 20th Century Fox, and became a playwright. And then graduated a semester ahead of my peers because my grandparents were helping me with school. And they said, if you can graduate early, we'd like you to. So in addition to, some loans, I was really fortunate. I got a scholarship while I was there, and decided to go back to New York and hope that all my friends would come to New York and start a theater company with me. And one of my mentors from USC had for 40 years, I guess 30 years at that point, brought the first ever international group to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 1966. And so a lot of my classmates had gone while they were still students. And so I ended up going to 4 seasons in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival with him. And it really showed me what was possible mentally, physically, emotionally, to do 5 shows in rep, working crew on 5 others. We had developed a show at USC called the Star Wars Trilogy on stage in half an hour. It was sort of like the reduced Shakespeare company. And because my mentor had directed George Lucas when he was at USC, we had Lucasfilms, go ahead. And so we did it the first, week, and it sold out. And so he added a show at midnight, 12:30, at 1 a.m, and then one at noon and one at 12:30. And so it was the first year in 40 years that they had ever made money doing this. They always lost money for USC. And so we were doing a stage version of Reservoir Dogs, and the BBC came and the Royal Scotsman came. And it was my first time dealing with reviews and dealing with directing while acting, while pushing my limits. And I think it showed me what was possible. And I'm so incredibly grateful for those opportunities. And so that was really, theater was my way in.
Wow. That's an incredible, first run experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think, have you, what would be the equivalent now to something like that? That is such a, it builds your foundation, right?
Well, I don't want to put myself in a comparison to the great Michael J. Fox, but I was so inspired by the story that I heard how while he was shooting Family Ties, he was also stepped into the role of, doing Back to the Future at the same time, and was in the van going back and forth and clearly managing his energy load, going home, sleeping just a few hours and pushing past what his perceived limits are. And now, given his diagnosis and his physical challenges, it's just no surprise to me what he communicates about his mindset and what he wrote about in his book. And, it's super inspiring. And so I think any opportunity we all have to practice working at our edge of capability. I think for me, years before that, I had done something called Outward Bound. And my dad thought it was a great character building thing. And that was the first time that I was like falling asleep, standing up while carrying an 80-pound food bag on my shoulders. And, I started out not being able to carry a canoe.
Yeah.
And by the end of the 3 weeks, I was carrying it for 500 steps at a time. I was kind of a scrawny dude. And so I think those moments were really defining of what was possible. And so I'm really fortunate for some of those that, maybe I wouldn't have chosen. I don't think I would have been like, what do I want to do this summer? Yeah, Outward Bound,
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's crazy. So you did that, and then how did you kind of get into this like side thing? It's not a side thing because a huge thing now, but how did that all like go?
Yeah. How
Evolve.
did you break into the performer's mindset? Yeah.
Well, in the same high school where they had arts funding, they had a college level psychology course being offered by two people who became my favorite teachers. And so that really introduced me to the foundation of psychology. I had gone to a therapist when my parents divorced, so I had an experience of that was very useful in terms of finding my voice. And I think that I was somebody that I saw. My mom was in AA, and really it saved her life. And I think it really set a foundation of how talking things out could be really valuable. She was also a hippie and an artist and a mystic and a poet and an astrologer. And so people came to her for advice. I noticed that a lot of my friends liked to come over and chill with my mom. And so I ended up being that person in college and after college where people came to for advice. And for a while, I loved it. I felt like I was sort of following in her footsteps and felt valuable, and I had this need to please, so that was getting satisfied until the point where I was like, God, it's been the same conversation over and over again with the same person. It's getting kind of late. And it was the first time it didn't feel good, and I started to feel like there needed to be a boundary. And I thought, well, what if I did this? Like, what if this was something that I did? Then maybe they'd have to respect that. And so that was a little bit of a catalyst for thinking about doing it more professionally. And one summer, it was the summer of 2001, I had gone to Edinburgh for the third time. And when I came back, I guess it was right after, was that the summer that Princess Diana died, or was that the summer before? I can't remember now which year she passed. But I do know that I came back and 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And I had been wrestling with, what do I do with my days in between acting jobs? And I just knew that I didn't want to be coming from an energy of fear about everything. I didn't want to be planting seeds of like, I want to have things go well, but I'm also worrying at the same time. And I know that's maybe easier said than done. But after 9/11, it was a similar pause in the industry and the world where we just couldn't do business as usual. And so all the things I'd been thinking about, I started to offer the world. I started to offer a life coaching session. I had been studying feng shui and how to set up environments intentionally. And so I gave away one session of different things that I did while everybody else was waiting for the industry to pick back up. And it led me to a photographer who worked for a magazine, who took my favorite headshots I'd ever taken, and started to develop these relationships in and around the industry, and also finding people not in the industry around LA and building community. And so that continued for a long time. But I didn't always feel like yoga, which I loved, held up for me in the waiting room.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't always feel like some of the things I was reading about, like The Secret or, The Power of Mind or any of these things that felt like on the edge of science, it didn't really feel sturdy to me anymore. It felt inspiring, but not sturdy. And so here I was going into potentially life-changing moments and feeling like my nerves would overtake me, or I'd get distracted by head noise, or one thing would piss me off in the room and then I couldn't focus on anything else. I didn't have any sense of directing focus or mental toughness or confidence in that way. And so my confidence came when the results came, but it didn't come from a process or a practice. And so a friend of mine was a college coach and then was now on air as a host. And he introduced me to the world of sports psychology and connected me with both a sports psychologist and a head coach for a football team. And in that process, I started devouring podcasts and listening to science. This is before Huberman Lab. This is before some of the other podcasts had kind of blown up. And I remember just listening to this one podcast over and over again. I may have listened to it 14 times. And I'm driving 2.5 hours in my car to auditions in Santa Monica and to jobs out, wherever they were. And I didn't mind it because I was getting this education. I'm taking screen grabs on my phone so later I can track down the time code and transcribe it so I can remember some of these things about risk and risk taking and where confidence comes from. And I was at the time teaching an audition class at an acting studio in Hollywood. I was at Warner Laughlin Studios. And Warner Laughlin, she's always been such an incredible mentor to so many people and just created such a safe environment for people to feel like they're best in a world that feels hard. And so she really gave a lot of us permission to fly as teachers and didn't have an audition program. So she asked another actress, Hilary Tuck, and I to create an audition program. And while we were doing that, Hilary and I were like, well, we've had 1,000 experiences that went wrong. What did we learn from those things about what we can't control, about how we would do it differently, about what we would say, separate from acting technique? What are the things around it come up before, during, and after? And so I think both of us in our classes together, and then she went off and had a baby, and then she went off to have another baby, and I went off to have my child. And so I think we were thinking about these things around the craft. And when I came back, I didn't want to offer the same thing that was offered out there. And so we created a pilot program called the Actor's Mindset. And the Actor's Mindset had mostly actors in it, but some executives from Deluxe or Technicolor, some people that were in the sports world. And so all of a sudden, we're now working with executives for their offsite, and we're working with coaches, and we were brought in to coach the top 24 high school quarterbacks in the country on the NFL Network. And I'm like, how is this happening? And it's because we're all battling the same things. They have their own way of battling nerves and head noise around being on camera and now name, image, and likeness and dealing with threats through direct messages and things like that. And we all have triggers on social media. We all get nerves. We all have to find ways to perform at our best. And so we started to identify these different pockets of people that needed the same training. And so we developed programs on the fly, inspired by devouring books and reading podcasts and not being a researcher for Stanford, but understanding what's happening at Stanford. We built a bridge. And I think so that people at home don't have to spend hundreds of hours doing it, we wanted to make them actionable, not just a nice idea, but like, how do we do something about this in 2 minutes or less?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this bridge.
The bridge.
The bridge.
Well, I think, there's a lot of information out there. And there's a lot of information that even when it's useful, generally speaking, people don't know how to do it. So I think there are a lot of well-meaning people who have tried to guide me through the years where I come into a room and they're like, just relax. Awesome. How? Right? Like if I get to the point where I'm in the room, does that mean I shouldn't feel nervous when I'm told just relax? A lot of people have this thing about nerves where they've had an experience in the past where their nerves have overtaken them. They've sweat bullets. They've forgotten their lines. Things have not go well. They've trembled, their dry mouth. Like And so there's a moment where the nerves happen and the interpretation of what's happening is this is bad. Oh no. And now understanding the science behind it, that's literally what causes the parts of us where we've worked so hard to prep to not show up. So it's partly the moment that we start to interpret the nerves as being bad, that there's a challenge. And so again, I think there's really well-meaning advice that gets thrown around. And I think a lot of time, just breathe. Awesome. Once, many times, through my nose, through my mouth. Am I supposed to be Kapalabhati breathing like I do in yoga class? Like, do I want more energy, less energy? Like, tell me what to do, but give me context. And so I think part of it is like, what is something that reduces it down, that's backed by science, that's super simple, and that everybody has access to? There's studios out there where actors are being told to take medications to deal with nerves, right? Like beta blockers and things like that.
Yeah.
And everybody needs to be on their own journey with regards to medications. I'm not an anti-medication person. I do think that we all have an eye towards sustainability. So what happens if the medication doesn't work anymore? Do I need more? What happens if I leave it at home? What happens if I run out of it? Can I do my job on the day? And so I think having the opportunity to have tools in our pocket is really important. And I think part of that requires experimentation when it's not for all the marbles, because it feels like it's really hard to trust something in a live stakes environment if I've never practiced it outside. And so a lot of times the other thing I think that artists do is they just practice in ideal conditions with their favorite coach, in their favorite classroom, with their favorite actors, on a good night's sleep. And I can tell you, like, I do not know of one job that I've ever booked where I was in ideal conditions. Something was going on. And so if we don't practice that way, I love that phrase that smooth seas do not make a skilled sailor.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, how do we do what some of the greats do, whether it's in sport or whether it's artists like Yo-Yo Ma, who practices starting out in the wrong note and then recovers from that. Or Michael Phelps, whose coach would fog up his glasses and then say, okay, now practice. And so when that happened during the Olympics, he swam an entire 2 lengths of the pool with water in his glasses and couldn't see, but he knew how many strokes it would take because he'd been in that situation before. And I just don't think actors are doing that consciously. I don't think they're training off balance. I don't think they're putting themselves in less than ideal conditions. And I don't think that if they do, it's because they're controlling that environment. I think it's somebody who's kind of got some kind of weird control-y, mind gamey thing going on. And that's not what I'm about.
Well, let me ask you this, because, there's been the conversation of the pros and cons of self-tapes forever, but also most commonly these last 2 years.
Yeah.
That is sort of, I guess it depends on who the actor is and what environment they thrive in, but that is essentially giving the actors the control of their surroundings and making that space the most comfortable. And I've had other actor friends tell me, like, they went to go help a friend self-tape and they literally had a projection of their lines against the wall. Like, they're getting really creative so they don't have to memorize, which is whatever your choice is in your process. But it's interesting to sort of take that perspective and look at the industry that we're in right now.
Yes. Do you have a question?
Short answer.
Yeah.
No, it's like, do you find that it's a sort of more of a negative space than a positive one right now with how especially actors that are coming up right now in the industry?
Yeah.
What do you think of that, the environment?
Well, I tend to look at things as an opportunity, because we can look at it as a threat or we can look at it as a challenge. And those play out in terms of how our brains work. If we feel like we have limited resources and we are under threat, then our brain and our body behave differently. And when we see it as a challenge, then actually the best parts of ourselves can come forth. I think there's a limit. I think there's a limit to how much people want to work in isolation. So I see both sides. I see the idea that we need to be able to work on set when the director doesn't come up and give us notes. We need to be able to work on set when they say, give us something else or keep going, or working on my first soap and they didn't even come out of the booth because that's not how it works. So I like to think keeping the end in mind. How do we want to be when those moments arrive? And how can we be practicing and training for that? So I think working in self-tapes does allow us some opportunities. Now, some actors have such a frequency of them that they've built little hacks for themselves. I certainly at times have said if there's a piece of a longer script, if I had 4 scenes and very little time, and the third scene I was shaky on a section of it, if it was a phone call or if it was like I was a doctor or a lawyer and I was reading something, I might tape it up. I know we've seen incredible performances from Marlon Brando who would read off of cue cards. So we can train ourselves to deal with just about any circumstances. It's getting dependent in a way that isn't going to set us up for our own success that I get concerned about. When we build these dependencies on things and we don't have a flexibility mindset, we don't have the ability to adapt and adjust. And I do think for anybody who's feeling burnt out with working in isolation or working in a way where they feel like they've taken on multiple jobs that maybe they are frustrated by, even though we ought to be able to develop those skills, I think that's part of the opportunity for us to enact change. It's an opportunity for us to have conversations with casting, with showrunners, with people who create the timeframes and the budgets and the studios and, the parent companies themselves and say, this isn't working. So how can we enact change both ways? The things we can control, the things we can have agency over, and the things that we just have to deal with today.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like it can go to the negative on our side of it, because I've found that with self-tapes during this time, it's been, some actors get on set and they can't take the note, and then it comes back to us and they're like, Jen, why didn't you know this guy couldn't take a note, or do this XYZ that we needed him to do? And that part really works against the actor, where in the room we would be able to figure that out very quickly.
For sure.
And then also I've had it go where on set an actor, they now think they know all. And so they're like, well, I want to do this with this character. And the director and the producer are like, no, we want this. And they're like, no, this is how I've seen it. I've given this backstory, it's like these. And I'm just like, whoa, I feel like we are getting a bit into a sense of a situation where we've put so much reliance on the actor, which is why I'm not a huge fan of continuing the self-tape world. But because I think there's so much that you can suss out in a room, and also not to it sounds rude, but to kind of check an actor of I get that you thought you were the director on your self-tape, because you were, but now even though we hired you off this, we may want you to do something completely different.
That's so great, Jen. There's 2 things I'm hearing in there. One of them is we don't know how many takes somebody took to get that tape, right? Could be 37. I know there's a lot of actors who are obsessive or perfectionistic and who really want to put forth their best work. And so they're motivated to keep going no matter what. And then even if they craft this Frankenstein tape to send off, you don't know what it took to get there. And will they stand up to whatever's going on, the pressure of the situation? You don't know, because you don't have that FaceTime. And normally you would be able to see and you'd vet it and you'd go, this actor was having a rough day. This actor took, I gave them the benefit of the doubt and they still were challenged. And I don't want to put them and myself in that situation by sending them to set that they may not be ready, or they may not be in, given the options. I'm not going to send that one forward right now. So what I'm really hearing is there's a reason why we are doing things the way we're doing them. And it's to try to save. We're trying to save time. We're trying to save money by seeing more people and having them do stuff on their own, so that you can manage within the budgets you're offered, the time that you're given. And, that's a downstream thing. We're handed down those parameters by other people who are trying to save in an effort to put money elsewhere or keep it for themselves, or whatever the case may be. And so I think there's a cost to doing things each of these different ways. Some of them are hidden costs, right? There's a cost to only having 2 writers and not having a writer's room. There's a cost to having actors do everything themselves. They don't get the time to collaborate. you don't get a chance to interact with them and help them see other perspectives. And so I think the more that we can hear these perspectives, we might make decisions differently on every part of the constellation that goes into making TV and film, plays, whatever craft we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's, we talk about a lot within the casting community. It's a big part of why sort of a certain contingency of casting directors don't want to go back into the office, because they can take
Sure.
on more projects.
Sure.
And so that's, there at every level, there's a version of this that is not being spoken about, which is, I think, what we are as, Tipsy Casting and as casting directors, we want to be more open and more engaged in the community of what everybody is facing at every level.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's always an opportunity cost for something.
Well, and Jen, I know you're in the UK right now, and I think, tell me, I'm curious to know what you both think about what your experience has been hearing about The Crown, the way The Crown is cast, the way The Crown is shot, because my understanding is that it's well funded. There is a ton of time to do each episode. There's a ton of time for casting. They have the top directors, arguably, in the world. And so actors I know that have auditioned for and been part of that show are like, what is happening? How do we get to make art this way?
Yeah.
And so there's an example of what's possible. Now, on the other side, well, we can talk about Breaking Bad another time, because they in Star Wars operated under very tight budget constrictions and made great art too. But I'm curious to know what your thoughts are around that, because we so often hear about the complaints and the things that don't go well. Are we looking to examples of things that might be going well?
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think you've touched a really good point in that we do have examples of how things can be done well. And I think, to be fair, I read an article. I wish I could remember where it is. I'll try to find it and link it in the episode info. But it was all about how pretty much the strike right now that's happening is going to reset kind of industry standards, because what was happening prior to the strike and prior to COVID, even so much so kind of coming out of COVID, is that you had so much content and so much out there that Netflix and Amazon and all the studios and everything are now spreading what used to be, if you have a $10 million pot, and it used to be like, okay, you get 2 million, you get 2 million, you get 2 million. Now for 5 projects, now they're saying, okay, let's do 10 projects and you should only get 1 million, which then puts on, an extra amount of pressure of time and effort and all that kind of stuff. So I think when you have something where, like, I don't know Netflix like business structure, so I can't speak to it, but from what I gather, from just common sense, is that they get to, because The Crown has done so well and was such kind of a hit. And I've met the guy who cast it, and he's lovely. But I think because they know that's going to automatically give them some kind of financial returns because it's such a hit, they're like, okay, here's more money, here's more time, here's more directors. Like, but when you're under the constraints of, you get a 2 million indie and we need it done in 3 weeks, and all these things, then you kind of, it's that trickle down effect of every little thing is then going to be quicker, less done, done less well. And so you just kind of keep going. And so I think what's happening with the strike is, kind of my own 2 cents, is I think the studios and even like independent production companies are going to shrink their slates, because I think what we are seeing is just like the quality of content not as high as it used to be, unless you are a Game of Thrones or whatever, that you've already proven yourself. But I mean, you even kind of look at, if you go back and rewatch, I've been rewatching Game of Thrones, and if you look at season 1, even though it was phenomenal, the like VFX and stuff compared to season 7 is like
Totally.
night and day, like, because again, as it's building all this subscribership and everybody's watching, then they get the point of like, oh, okay, here's more money, here's more time, here's more effort. Like, you can shoot in 10 countries now instead of 2, so it's I think that's a huge part of why that's happening. And I'm hoping that with this strike, maybe one of the positives to come out of it is, I think everyone is feeling the purse strings struggle. And I think studios and networks, especially, and maybe even production companies, will, instead of trying to like spread wealth amongst many projects, take that money and make good projects and maybe not as many.
I also think that we've seen in the last 5 years that pilot season has died, and I think that's a very good example of the same thing, where for the network television side of things, it was always, let's do as many pilots as we can, let's shoot them as fast as possible, because that was the space that we were in for the first quarter of the year. Everybody was competing against each other to cast the talent. It was the same people that were being circulated, who's going to test, who's not going to test, and then they only pick up a small handful, and then by the fall, half of those shows are gone. And I think that was the impact of premium cable or streamers were having on the network television, because for the other side, it was about quality versus quantity. And I think that now we've spilled over into that space where the network TV can't keep up, and now pilot season doesn't really exist.
Yeah, there's so many changes that I'm hearing about, and I think the decision makers have a particular mindset, right? And the thing that I would whine about next week is the idea of what can we get away with. And I think that there is where do I put my resources is different than what can I get away with. And I think a lot of the advertising models, when you're getting onto free TV, it's like, well, we're going to maximize the amount we bring in because we can spend the least and still get ad dollars, which is almost going back to the way things were on network television. It's almost like there's some big circle happening.
Yeah.
My hope is that we start to think about, when we're putting money into budgets, are we talking about getting away with things? Or are we talking about a quality of experience where people want to come back and work for you? Because I think what we're hearing is like, okay, last year I had an opportunity to do something that I didn't think was in the cards for me anymore. I had the opportunity to be the lead in a Christmas movie that came out in December. It was my first time being in the MOW world that way. And so I've been developing these projects for years, and the people that I'm working with, I see the way they've been doing them in Canada, here in the States. And they basically categorize it. There's two ways to do it. One of them is to call in every favor imaginable and ask people to do it for peanuts. And then at the end of using those relationships up, they make the most money, and then they go find a whole new group of people to do that with. And they treat people like batteries. Mm-hmm. There are other people who are seeking to do it differently, where they say, I want to work sustainably. I want to have the same crew come back. I want to be able to work with the same people again. I want them to have a good experience. So they don't look at cost, they look at investment. And they say a little bit of extra thought for this actor, a little bit of extra thought about on-set nutrition, a little bit of extra thought about one extra day, so that somebody's not driving home and compromising their health and well-being by driving home. The same way I actually had to, sort of speak up last year and say the turnaround times are unsustainable. What are we doing? Are we trying to get away with things, or are we trying to invest in people? Are we treating people like batteries, or are we trying to build relationships? Are we trying to hustle and grind, or are we trying to sustain? These are the things that I think about. And one of the ways that we coach is to deal with what the circumstances are. But I think what we're hearing is we have the opportunity to speak up and say, this isn't working. And we have to punch up. We have to let people know, like, this is not sustainable. So stop it. Like, cut some of these things out. You're not thinking about this in a way where, if we don't take risks on some of those pilots, we may end up having a different problem where it's like, people don't want to tune in and watch our shows because everything feels the same. Because now we have AI who's generating a template based on the past and not originating. So it's like, well, are we setting up a problem for ourselves in 3 years by trying to get away with something? Or do we need to take risks and come up with everything everywhere all at once at the same time as we make Indiana Jones 5, right? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah. That was a great example.
Thanks.
Yeah. Wow. I want to talk about a little bit, with the industry being upside down and nobody knows what's going to happen or how long it's going to take to happen is the big part of it. And also outside of the industry, the world is a little bit upside down.
Hmm.
So, how do we, I think, using the tools that you've developed for the sake of sort of accessibility, how do we keep a glasses half full kind of mentality? Or how do we move forward in a positive space so we don't drown?
It's such an important question. That's such an important question. So we don't drown. Okay, so my first introduction to psychology was all about the problems we have. We studied the DSM. Back then, it was like the DSM 3 or 4. Now it's the DSM 5. It's a whole book of all the different things that we might have, ways we can be diagnosed, the problems that we have. It wasn't until positive psychology and moving up through sports psychology, we started to think about optimization of self. There was a whole spectrum. We were just trying to get back to neutral. And as opposed to like, how good can it get? I say that because one of the things that I think artists can learn from athletes and coaches is this phrase. Maybe it comes from the Stoics, maybe it comes from great coaches, which is only control what you can control. And I don't even know if control is the right word, because sometimes I feel like that has its own sort of stigma to it. But I think the idea is, what is within your area of influence? We can go out and we can have public conversations on social media, in the world, in front of studios. We can get involved in our elections. We can weigh in when it comes time to vote. Those are things we can do. We can also spend time worrying, complaining, and having the same conversations over and over again and not moving the needle. In that same way, whether we speculate that it's going to be 100 days like last time, whether we know it's going to be the end of the year, the approach that I took a few months ago was, I'll meet you in October. Like, I'm going on this journey and I'm going to do this for the next 4 months, and I'll meet you in October. And my main thought was, how do I want to be when that moment arrives? Because I can still have some of these conversations, but I'm not going to obsess about them. I've done that in different parts of my life and it doesn't work well. So I think there's a difference between a positive mindset and a toxically positive mindset. What I mean by that is, we can do this spiritual bypass thing where we just pretend like everything's great and grin all the way through our stress and worry. And that's not really what I think we're about. We are about understanding what it takes to have grit. And grit, the definition of grit by Dr. Angela Duckworth, is to have passion and perseverance over time. Which means fall down 7 times, get up 8. It means, how do I come back from hard moments? And it means resiliency comes from having a certain optimistic outlook that things are getting better. The way that I know things are getting better is process, is a little bit of progress over time. And those are only measured by the things I can control on a daily basis, not by outcome. I spent too many years going, how am I driving? How's it going, based on bookings? I would spend time doing what a lot of great people out there offer advice on, which is, look at your booking ratio, look at your callback ratio, change things up. Okay, that math and that science makes a lot of sense. But I think we're ignoring 20 things we can do that will make our work better. From sleep, daily practice habits, exercise, the way we memorize, the way we de-stress, like all of these, whether we're confident going in the room, these things are trainable skills. So I can worry my way through the next 6 months, right? Or I can work on getting a little bit better at one thing so that when October comes, I'm ready for that. And if I might, I've been so inspired by Kobe Bryant's journey as a player and as a human. And part of it is, when he came back and started playing basketball when he was, I guess, 10 or 11, he lived in Italy. And he played a lot of soccer, and he came back and moved to the outskirts of Philadelphia. And he played in a summer league. And in that summer league, he scored 0 points. And I don't mean in a game. I mean for the whole summer. He scored 0 points. And his dad pulled him aside and said, listen, whether you score 0 points or 60 points, I'm going to love you just the same. So what do you want to do? And he thought about it, and he decided he was going to get up the next day and he was going to get better at one tiny thing for a month. outside of practice, he decided what he was going to get better at.
Mm.
And the next summer, he scored 10, 11 points, which is not bad. It's not great. And then 2 years later, he led the state. So he had a growth mindset, and he was determined to improve himself over time, consistently over time. And all those people who already knew they were great, the guys he was like, I can't beat them today. They have mustaches. Like, he basically was like, I'm not going to win today, but I'm going to get better. And those people knew they were good and didn't try. And so he did that through his whole career. He ended up playing in high school and, obviously had a lot of accolades, went to the Lakers, but he had this insatiable desire to learn, grow, and get better, which continued. He'd be in the middle of the All-Star game with Michael Jordan and be like, Michael, how do you do this thing when you're dealing with, and Michael just laughed and recognized himself in this young human and offered him advice. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing that happened when Kobe went to make his first movie. He reached out to Jeffrey Katzenberg, he reached out to industry people, and he made Dear Basketball. And it's because of that hunger and that curiosity and willingness to get better over time that he is so inspirational to me, more so than how many points he scored. And he showed us what's possible. And I think so many actors don't know how to do that. They think watching a show is getting better. No, it's entertaining. There are things you can scaffold around it. You can do script analysis. You can turn off the sound. You can, look up some of the writers and sort of have more context for the industry. You can understand tone if you're watching new shows. Like, there's things you can do to work towards your craft, but that's different than what these elite athletes who are the best in the world are doing. And so building a bridge, it's like, well, if we hear that, what do we want to do about it? And so that's the approach that I'm taking over how do I want to get better between now and October? How do I want to get better about my feeling in my body and my skin? How do I want to take care of this eye twitch? How do I want to take care of my relationships and lift them up? How do I want to, feel when I'm given the next huge opportunity, as opposed to like, oh God, I got to get started again. I've taken a 4-month panic break, Sorry, that was familiar. A long rant,
No. Yeah. It's a very relatable rant, and it's also that 4-month panic break. I feel that close.
You feel it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really amazing. And honestly, it's like, it is one of those things too, where I feel like sometimes taking that baby step every day is something that's not industry related. Because we get asked that question by actors a lot as casting directors, like, what can I be doing to get better? And I'm like, sometimes like, go for a run, go paint a, canvas or something, because I think sometimes, especially in our industry, we get so wrapped up into what we do. And, the fact that we don't have control over the fact that there's a strike happening right now and we can't get work and, all these things. It's like that when you can go and just like let go and turn your mind off in some other way, or go spend time with your family or walk your dog or, do something like that, is always super beneficial as well. And that doesn't mean that you're not working towards that goal in the end. It's actually like helping you achieve it, which I think sometimes gets lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's great about what you're saying, Jen, is I don't know if a lot of actors know why your advice is great. Like, going for a run sounds like somebody's like reading a Cosmo article. But when you really look at the science of that, when you have those endorphins, when you actually let your body focus on raising and elevating your heart rate, it's going to affect the way you memorize your next script. Like, it's going to give you capacity to have breath, which is the source of our artistry, whether we're present or not. When you go walk your dog, or you do a painting, like you said, and do art that has nothing to do with outcome. Like, you're not doing it to get a grade or get approval on social media or to book the job. Those are the things that get us through hard moments. And so I think it's really important to understand the why. I think a lot of actors have the opportunity to ask themselves, why are they doing the things that they're doing? That's one of the blessings of this time. Why have I been doing things the way I've been doing them? And I think that's confronting, but I think it gives us the opportunity to set us up for the next 14 years and not just the audition on Tuesday.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's something that is so vital to the process, even when we're not in this moment of the unknown, I think that is when someone is a well-rounded human being, when they are actively investing their energy in other aspects of their lives, going to travel, making sure you're well read, like all of those things are so vital to the kind of who you are when you are embracing a character. It gives you layers, and I think that that is something that is so obvious to so many people, especially as a casting director. Like I have found it that, and it's something, I think it's a cultural thing within the US, that like you nose to the ground, work, and you will get what you want, right? But in every other part of the world there's balance, and there's, you know, is giving time for yourself and making sure you're doing all these other things to so you can evolve as a human and have these layers. And so I think that that's, we find it when we're casting internationally, that you find it a little bit easier as a casting director when we're looking at international actors versus when we're looking at American actors.
Well, doesn't that reflect back to when you were looking at men for roles? I don't even know if it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Did you find that a lot of the arguments were, we need to look at actors out of Australia, we need to look at actors out of the UK or Europe, because, you know, the kind of men that are coming in are not really feeling the way that they need to for some of these roles? I mean, I think that says a lot about the evolving roles of what masculinity is. And, you know, looking at the way Justin Baldoni and his podcast talks about masculinity is really beautiful. But I also think, like you're saying, balance happens whether we are conscious about it or it just happens to us. So is our balance going to be, I have to take 4 months off because I have a health crisis? Or is balance going to be something that I take for myself, where I'm going to say, no, I'm going to take up boxing. I'm going to become a sculptor and a potter, or celebrate Naked Gardening Day, or I'm going to take that trip. Because that perspective, I wish that I believed that advice when I was told it during college. I had an acting teacher who was like, you're a good talent, Joe. Like, you need to go live life now. And I was like, I can't do anything about that tomorrow. Tell me what I need to get better at. And the advice fell on deaf ears. I couldn't hear it at 18 because I wanted the quick fix. I wanted the hack. And I think that so many of us do. Give me the results now. And I just, there's traps laid all over that, right? Just looking for the quick fix.
Yeah. I mean, I
do think
especially
that's a very American thing.
Yeah. I said that I think also, like, in the generation that exists now, where, you know, dating is a swipe away. There's something always better around the corner, what is it? Instant gratification that, you know, we all crave now. And if something takes too long, people are not willing to invest the time and energy to get there. So it's that reset I feel like a lot of us need, especially, I mean, I think also COVID didn't help that aspect of it all. Yes, we were isolated, but, you know, the delivery services, like all of those gig things that are now part of our generation, out of our culture, like, you know, it's all built into who we are now.
And I think there's such a cost to it. I mean, there's a literal financial cost. If I go on Postmates now, it's 35% more expensive than just even normally ordering in, to go through every single fee to get that food the way I became accustomed to. But then there's a cost to the instant gratification. I mean, I think we're trading dopamine for oxytocin, like, or the other way around. Like, oxytocin, the connective tissue of our relationships and physical touch and the things we need in the world, whether it be from a dog or a human or something else, we're getting these dopamine hits. And these dopamine hits are like, I don't know, it's like eating cotton candy. It's like delicious for a second, but if you give that to me all day, every day, I'm not going to feel well. And so I don't even think we know we don't feel well, or we don't actually want this instant gratification. Like, there used to be this period of time where we didn't know something and we were bored.
Yeah.
You know, I know I'm the old guy who leaves 4-minute messages, but I literally spent hours being bored. And I understand now that the science of that is that it makes us more creative. So if we don't want to be creative, then don't get bored. Just be distracted. So it's like the cost of all this stuff, the hidden cost that we don't even see. That's what I love learning about in regards to some of the science, because it helps me understand, like, okay, so do I want to spend my night just scrolling on apps and getting quick dopamine boosts? Or do I want to have a different experience tonight, tomorrow, and moving forward?
Yeah, I feel like it's, one of the best like instances I can think of to this is like if you saw COVID babies who were born during the pandemic, and I had a few friends who had babies either right before or during, and their children were very delayed in not a medical way, but it's just like because they had no human interaction
Socially.
other than their family, that they then, their speech came in 6 months later. They, when they did go to school, they had lots of behavioral issues because they didn't know how to be around children their age. So I think it is something that even that's a very, exaggerated example, but I do think it happens to all of us that when we get into these, things, how you were describing the swapping and not getting that, like what you actually need in your life to make you happy and like fulfilled and, engage in life. Yeah, I mean, we could go down the rabbit hole because I think social media is a big crazy situation. But I think there's a lot that contributes to why this is happening. But I love everything that you've said, because I didn't know too much about the performer's mindset when we first started chatting. And this is just like, I know so many people are going to get so much from this, because I think it's something that is very useful for no matter if you're an actor, an athlete, a teacher, a mom, like whatever you are. I think there's something to take from this in every aspect of your life, which is really cool.
Absolutely.
Well, that's really kind, Jen. I'm glad it's resonating with you. And, thanks, Jessica, for connecting us all to have the conversation, because it's part of what our hope is. And, our hope is that we've been wanting to try to change the way we've been doing things. And this feels like an opportunity for us to do that on a much bigger scale and doing it together instead of isolated. Actors just doing it on their own, casting doing it on their own, directors doing it on their own. And, maybe there's a metaphor for the fact that there's a lot of allegiances and alliances and people showing up for each other that we can lean into and find these tiny rays of light within what feels like a hard time.
Yeah. If you could give us, for our listeners, as like one practice that you find useful for everybody that you've worked with, as like if it's a daily practice to do or something, just like this, when we first started, we asked you how you were and you said, I got to check in with myself for a second. Like what is a useful thing that we can all do on our own to help sort of move us forward in this positive way?
Well, I think that one of the values we have is that we tend to just go, and then crash into the next thing we have to do. And then we sort of collapse. And so the broad way of answering your question, I would say, is to pause before we work and to pause after. And so I mean that when I'm on set, that after I'm done, before I look to how did I do to everybody else, that I pause and I check in with myself. That before I know if I'm ready, when somebody says, is everybody ready? Like, do I need something? Do I need a sip of water? Do I need a moment to breathe? I've just been given 7 notes from 4 different departments and they've been fixing my mic. Do I need a second? It's going to go better if I take a second. And I think that same thing is true at the beginning and end of every day. So the huge opportunity we have is the first and last hour of our day. There's so much great science that says what we do in that first hour sets up whether we crash in the afternoon, whether we're filtering through a more negative lens, whether we've filled up or we're coming into the day already empty and urgently and hustling. And that last hour is what sets up our sleep. So, if we can turn off the screens an hour before bed as a general principle and fill that time with reading, journaling, meditating, taking a bath, talking to another person, being off of this kind of light from screens and TVs and iPads and iPhones, it's going to set up the internal clock, our hormones. It's going to set up deeper rest, and we're going to wake up feeling better the next day. So the principle of pausing before we work and pausing after is everywhere. So if you want to pause to take a breath before you go, you can do that the same way you might pause to acknowledge the hands who created your meal before you eat it. If you want to pause before you go through a doorway, the same way you will before you step into an audition or on set, what do you want to do as you cross the threshold? Do you want to come in confidently? Do you want to come in, embracing the opportunity ahead, or do you want to be a scattershot? So taking these moments to pause can look a lot of different ways. And that to me is probably the simplest and maybe the most overlooked advice that's out there.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's and it's very much in our own control.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't feel like it, right? Everybody's
Okay,
looking
Joe.
at us. Yeah.
Yes, Joe, we got a very, very, very important question to wrap this up with. I mean, prepare
Great.
yourself. It's very deep. It's very, this is how you're going to be judged. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
If the world was ending tomorrow and you had only one cocktail to cheers the end of the world, what would it be?
Well, I would go to Tuscany and I would get a Brunello di Montalcino, and I would open it and aerate it, and I would share that bottle with the people that I was closest to, and I would savor every sip of that red wine.
Is that a wine?
Brunello di Montalcino. Yeah. It's
I'm not fancy, Joe.
A type of varietal. Well, that's one of the things that came about this last 10 years is I was like, I just drink red wine or white wine. I don't know what I like. I don't know what's out there. I know you're supposed to do this rule with steak versus fish. And, the practice of getting together with people and learning about an area, I was like, oh, I do like this one more than this one. And this one is made more naturally. And this one, I don't know, is now something that I feel is special. So I started drinking one glass of a really nice type of wine instead of 2 or 3 that was sort of meh. And I felt better the next day. And so there's something about that whole process that I fell in love with. Anyway, there's my 4-minute voicemail message about Brunello.
I love that. I love that. Well, Joe, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been so fun. Can you tell everybody where you can find your performer mindset stuff, how to follow you on Instagram? Because I think, like I said, I think everyone can learn something from you. So how can people find you, follow you, use your tools?
Yeah, I think the best ways are at the Performer's Mindset on Instagram. You can find at me, Joe Towne, on Twitter for as long as that's still going, and Instagram. And then our website is The Performer's Mindset. And on there, if you decide that you want some resources based on some of the things we talked about, it's all available. You can go and see what we were reading. You can hear these kind of conversations and podcasts. And if you're interested in exploring more, we really like to stay in touch with people and offer tools. So if we do a newsletter, it's got something to read, something to listen to, something to watch, something to practice, or a thought from one of us. We're not going to do 2 things. We're not going to spam you and email you every day. And we're not going to ask you within 30, this would be my next wine. We're not going to ask you within 30 seconds of you doing something, how we did.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. We'll link all of those things in our show notes and on YouTube and Instagram and all of the things. But we're really grateful for your time and all that you've been able to share with us and our listeners. And thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. What a pleasure, Jen, Jessica. I appreciate you creating the space for this conversation and wanting to have it. And I would chat with you both anytime. So thank you for having me.
Well, cheers. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Salute.
If you love listening as much as we love sharing, click subscribe on our YouTube channel or find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thanks for listening.